Who would you be if your portfolio had titles such as Captain Marvel, Avengers Infinity War, Thor Ragnarok, Guardians of the Galaxy, Captain America Civil War, Ant-Man, and the upcoming Black Panther 2? You'd either be an illustrator for Marvel Comics or Tim Croshaw, who's our guest for today. Tim is a specialist set designer who has worked on some of the biggest Hollywood blockbusters such as Inception, Gone Girl, Aquaman, and House of Cards. So if you've ever watched a Hollywood superhero film and wondered what goes on in the making of it, or thought about who designed the submarines and the palaces and the spacecrafts, or even questioned what went into designing spaces for a camera, today is your lucky day. I had reached out to Tim last summer and thoroughly enjoyed speaking to him and learning about the fascinating world of Hollywood and filmmaking. So I invited him to share his world with us today, and I promise it's a conversation not worth missing. My name is Vaissnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design practices and research projects that reflect the emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture Off Center features conversations with some exceptionally creative individuals who have extrapolated the traditional fields of architecture, planning, landscape, and urban design. So we'll just roll with it, and I'm just so really excited because till now we've had a bunch of episodes and it kind of tends to go more on professional practice, theoretical aspect.
Sure.
And yours is just going to be pure design and something that I'm so excited about because, Hollywood seems like such a fascinating place, especially from outside. And from our previous conversation last summer, it also seems like an industry that is kind of informal and follows the old school ways of working. So jobs aren't posted on LinkedIn, there are no formal interviews, and everything kind of works through the word of mouth recommendation. So what was your journey like? How did you break in and land your first design job in the art department?
Well, first off, thanks for inviting me to your world here, your podcast. My journey began just like everyone else's. It was a sort of a passion to actually do something a little adventurous and move out to Los Angeles. So I guess I should back it up a little bit. My wife and I, we were boyfriend, girlfriend at the time back in graduate school. Our background's in theater, so BFA in theater, both of us. She has a BA, I think, in mathematics as well.
That's a jump.
She was going to be an engineer. Yeah, she was going to be an engineer, aerospace engineer, I think, and then fell in love with theater. So, and so then we continued on into graduate school, got our MFAs from Florida State University, and then we decided we have three choices. We can either move to New York and try and work in Broadway. We can move in Chicago and, again, work in theater there as well. Or we can try and move to LA, where the weather's nicer, the climate, and then just in general, the more liberal environment of Los Angeles. And the movie business. And so that's what we decided on. It was kind of like, let's just go for it. We'll move out there and see what happens. But fortunately, my undergraduate actually had a pretty decent film program and alumni. So when I got out here, I knew a few individuals who I could call upon, particularly one woman named Dawn Snyder, who's an art director. She works over at CBS. She put me in touch with some contacts that she had, and through that, she gave me this book that was called the Art Directors Guild Directory. And this is years ago, a decade ago. And it was a book that had every member of the local, because it's a union. That's the reason why it's so hard to get in. It's a labor organization. And at that time, there were two different labor organizations, specifically in the art department. But anyways, there was this book that had everyone's email and phone number. So my wife and I basically, sitting in our apartment in Glendale, we had this Bible, this book of all these numbers of people that we revered, I guess you'd say, your favorite movies. You look who the designer was. You're like, oh gosh, I can't believe that I have the phone number for that person. So we would just cold call them. We made a script. We cold called people, and that led to meeting various individuals. I'd say we got a 90% positivity rate. Everyone was really enthusiastic. Most of these people love talking, and sharing. And I don't think there's no there's nothing better than asking someone to talk about themselves, so a lot of people are happy to oblige. So then I ended up taking a few visits to a few art departments, and I went to, there was a movie, I think it's a Michael Bay movie called The Island, and I met a man named Sean Hayworth, and he was set designer of that show. I think he might have been set designer and art directing. And then I met a woman named Andrea Carter, and she was the coordinator, art department coordinator. And we can get into talking about some of the roles later. But she said, hey, if you're looking for a job, my friend Melissa Bartley is looking for a PA on a TV show named Medium. I said, sounds great. Love the idea. Like, let me do it, So my first job was a PA on Medium, making like $600 a week. And if you know what a PA is, it's a production assistant. So specifically in the art department. So I would basically, the prerequisite is basically having a driver's license and a working car. So you're going to get things, the gopher. You're running drawings around the studio. You're driving across town to pick up, going on hardware runs, which means like picking, going to the guy who has all the doorknobs and all the window locks and the hinges and stuff like that. And so then we'd bring it back and then going and getting carpet samples and paint samples. So that was my first entry into that. The production designer on Medium was Jessica Kender, and she and I became friends. And she said, she was very kind, and she said, if you stick around for a year, I will do what I can. And she recognized that I knew I had a pretty good foundation, a good background with theater and set design and scene design. She knew that I could handle the job. So she said, if you stick around for a year, and then after, I'm going to try and get you in as a set designer. And then if I do, you have to promise to stick around another year before you leave. And so I was like, yeah, no problem. I love it. And so, yeah, I did like my 1 year and then got in the next year as a set designer. Like I said, it's a union. So there is a membership list, and you have to go through the membership list, and everyone has to turn the job down and have a good reason for it before you can get hired. So either you have a very unique speciality that gets you in. So there's that way. There's off roster hire is what it's called. And that's how I got in. I think when they called, I think there was 14 people on the list. It was just perfect. It was good timing. And so the other way to get in the union is to be on a project that's non-union, and the show will get flipped, they call it, or it's basically organized. So all the crafts then become union crafts. They were non-union, now become union. That's the second other common way to get in the union. But yeah, I was an off-roster hire. I was a lucky person. That's the honest truth. 100% lucky person.
In the brief period that, I was reaching out to people and just speaking, and you, in fact, put me in touch with Jess Kender and had a conversation with her as well, there was a striking difference in attitude that I saw between you guys who work in the movie industry and the other more traditional architects who are working in the building industry, just in terms of how they would respond to people, how open they were to having somebody under their umbrella and welcoming them into what they are doing. I thought just speaking to people who work in the art department or, in production design, just there was a certain sense of community, very, very oddly, even that extended towards people who were not yet part of that community. I don't know. I mean, it just felt kind of very utopian and unrealistic in a sense. Like,
sure.
How is every person I'm talking to just so good? Just how can every person be so warm? How can every person be so helpful? Like, everybody was pretty open about the union, about the roster, about just ethics of, working down the list and, just how hiring works. Of course, it was a really bad time to reach out to people because everything
shutting
was
down.
shut.
Yes. Unfortunately, I'd say if you were here now, it's the perfect time because the city is like on fire. And I mean like it's busy. It's not literally on fire because that's also a possibility with how this place is a desert. But anyways, yes, if you were here now, there's unfortunately there's a lot of work. So anyone who's looking, come out to Los Angeles and try your hand at it. What's the worst thing that could happen, right?
I know. But a huge part of just talking to people was also understanding what, as you explained, what a PA is, just understanding what those different roles are, because it seems like such a tight-knit community where everybody kind of knows what they're doing and just like happens to work in tandem. So it took me a while and speaking to a bunch of people to understand what those roles are. But for anyone who does not know the inner workings of an art department in films, Can you walk us through the roles and responsibilities of the art department and how it intersects with the other departments? So from pen to paper to production, how does everything flow?
Well, it's interesting. I want to touch on one thing you just said. It is a small community because when you get down to it, there's probably 250, 300 set designers, 1,200, maybe 2,000 art directors. So it's not a lot of individuals, and we all live in relatively the same area. So yeah, there is a benefit and a negativity to having such a small community because obviously, everyone knows everybody. But it's good. It's good. So hierarchy of the art department. So we have a head of the department, which is called the production designer. And that person is the intersect for the producers and the director. They're our department head. They're our director. They direct the visual feeling of the movie. They're the ones who are making the decisions. They're the ones traveling around the world, picking locations with the director. A lot of the times, to be fair, they're also advising the producer on what they can accomplish. And sometimes when we talk about the script, and nowadays the script is such an organic thing, it's always constantly evolving and changing. So a production designer can have some input on what they feel like is feasible within the script. So I'm not saying they are in the writer's room influencing their decisions, but I think they're a touchstone for the producer to come and say, we have this location on the side of a mountain, where someone's dangling from a helicopter and there's, snow and wind. How feasible is that? Is that something we can, what do you think? What's the budget number? What's the man days or something like that? So the production designer will be the person who takes that idea, one of the many of them from the script, take it to the art directors and the illustrators and the concept artists and work up a visual, like, sort of cue for it, and then return to the producers and say, here's the idea we have. This is what we think is feasible. Yada, yada, yada. So yes, hopefully that's gives people an idea what the production designer does. Right below or adjacent, it's hard to say below because it's such a collaborative process. I mean, literally everything's interconnected and everything reinforces the other. The production designer is only as good as his illustrators, and the illustrators are reinforced by set designers and art directors. So yeah, we're all interconnected. We all share. And we all hand off design work. It can be like a game of like catch. Like you work on something, then you pass it over to this person. They work on it, and they send it back to you. So it's very interesting. So art directors are a lot of the times the supervisor and the go-between between the production designer and sometimes the set designers. And their job will evolve and change too, because once this production actually starts getting really busy, and the production actually gets underway, construction, they'll be on the floor a lot more, interacting with construction, dealing with vendors, dealing with other departments, and also like still like checking in with their set designers and illustrators. So production designer, art directors, and in film, technically there's a supervising art director who will oversee all the art directors, because usually there's probably like 5 or 6 art directors, and those art directors can have special fields. There can be a locations art director who just handles all the locations. They might be the person flying to like Fiji or to Nepal or something like that to handle like.
I'd love to have that job.
Yeah, right. I mean, the other side of it can be like they can be the person who has to go to the seedy alley in like downtown Atlanta. So there's it sounds very fun if you get to go to those really remote, exciting places like Iceland or something like that. But there's also the downside of it where it's like the dirty alley, in some downtown suburban environment. Besides that, I touched on earlier, the illustrators and concept artists. They're like usually hired early on, and depending on their skill set and depending on, usually there's a balance of 3D artists and designers who will actually be designing in Maya or Modo. Nowadays, Unreal will be the render engine of choice to present their ideas. And they'll be working very quickly to just do iterations of ideas. The painterly illustrators and concept artists, they'll usually be working up a lot of keyframes, like the very specific moments of the movie. Like if you just pick one, for example, obviously, like you can imagine there was a really nice keyframe for like the battle during Civil War between like the two opposing sides of Avengers, right? So the airport scene. So if you probably go find the book of the concept art, you could probably flip to it and find like a a nice illustration, painted illustration of those keyframes. And so a lot of times those illustrators are hired early on to get the movie greenlit, because the producer and the studio and the financiers want to see what the feeling of the movie is going to look like. And so that's how a lot of times projects get lit. And sometimes, to be honest, the illustrators will get hired before the production designer, and they'll just work with the director and the writers to get the movie on a good foundation. So we've talked about production designer, art director, illustrator, and finally set designer, myself, which I think is the best job. Set designers can fill a lot of different needs for the art department. Primarily what our job is to take the work that the illustrators have done with the production designer and work with the art directors to create a buildable, shootable set. Now, there can be other times where the set designer can just be handed the idea because there's no time to have it work through illustration, or it's just a production designer's prerogative to rather have the set designer work up the interior of, the Avenger compound or something like that. I'm just picking sets out of the past. And so then you'll work it up. And then when it comes back to me again, or any other set designer, we'll actually do the CAD drawings, like the physical construction documents will be done by set designers. So, laying it out on a stage, doing all the really specific, shootable, and technical aspects of the set, knowing how to pull which walls, knowing where camera is going to be. So, and that conversation will happen between myself and the art director and other crafts. So you have to then sort of bring in special effects, visual effects. They'll have the discussions with those department heads and then come back to me and say, okay, Tim, set's going to cut off at 14 feet. So everything above 14 feet is going to be a digital set extension, and
like high-rise buildings and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very true. There was a show, I can't say the name of it, but we just did recently. We were doing a city, more or less. And yes, they just picked a point, like, okay, this is the height line we're going to do. Let's create a nice cut line at 14 feet. And everything above that is digital. Now, we still designed it, up to the 30th floor or whatever, but everything below 14 feet, we'd made construction documents for. The other stuff, we then just make sure it's nice and tidy, and we hand it off to visual effects so they can take that asset, make it shootable for them, which is a whole other process. So it's interesting because we still prepare, like you can say, like we do construction work for physical construction, but we also do construction work for virtual productions as well. And that's kind of like what I try and like pride myself in, is I don't see myself as like, just to say like there used to be like designers who were really good at Western towns, or designers that were good at making like ships. Like I've tried and present myself as a person who's very good at tackling any kind of project or any problem, and I fit myself into that role and do the best I can.
And there's so many parallels between the way architecture works and the way production and art department works, but so many ways in which they just like don't come neck to neck at all, just in the way roles and responsibilities, or even the workflow. You said sometimes the production designer just works with the illustrator to get the visuals going on. That would probably never happen in architecture, where you would do renderings for a project without the architect getting involved. So in that way, it's kind of interesting just how the workflow is structured, but also roles like a coordinator, or you have a project management consultant in architecture who would oversee just coordination of different departments. So it's really fascinating how in all like different design industries, how these roles are structured and how the gears kind of fit in within the watch. I mean, everybody works together and eventually the watch works, but it's that coming together, fitting between those little hooks and crannies and make sure that it keeps running. So when I started learning about it and, when I started speaking to people, it was just so fascinating where people started from. Somebody was a set decorator and then ended up doing something completely else. Just as you said, oh, this is definitely not for me. Like, I cannot do this. Or somebody took on a different role and, went on to be a production designer because they felt that their skill set was more tailored to what that role called for. So very, very fascinating. And the fun part is when we see movies on screen, none of this comes across, and that's part of the beauty of it. It's just you see it, everything just like working so well. It's like this was made to be, this is just some heavenly body created this, and it's supposed to all work, but we barely ever recognize logistics of it. So I want to change gears a little bit and talk about your work now, because it is so fascinating. And a lot of your projects are situated in the superhero and sci-fi universe. You're talking about Civil War right now. So you've designed Heimdall's observatory in Thor Ragnarok, the Asgardian refugee vessel in Avengers Infinity War, the submarine in Aquaman, and the Queen's throne room in the Guardians of Galaxy Volume 2. This is just some of like the very impressive portfolio you have. So can you talk a little bit about your creative process of designing these spaces, which you have absolutely no reference for, and that you might not have ever visited a place of comparable nature? I believe that on the one hand, it must be a thrill to kind of go crazy and use it as a canvas to build something out of the blue. But on the other hand, it also seems kind of scary not having any historical references as a starting point. Do you do a lot of research while designing? How does it work? How do you design these spaces?
I think each problem that we start with is tackled differently, but overall, it's all starting with research. But even before that, it's a communication with, again, what the production designer expects and like what his vision is for each particular set. And the ones you just said have very specific like parameters, borders, like constraints, which is good. Like for example, like Heimdall's, like we kind of had that in the previous movies, but it got blown up and was being rebuilt. So that was the whole idea of that particular set. It's like this was a transition between what it was in the past and what it is now. So Dan Hannon, was the production designer for that. And he had some specific ideas of like the cosmos and zodiac symbols. So the interior of it had these big sort of like, almost look like, they weren't necessarily cogs, but they were almost like dials that had different symbols and such on them. So yeah, I mean, it kind of can be sometimes that simple. Like the production designer says, let's do something that's feels like it's a zodiac symbol, it has a feeling of a clock, and let's run with it and see what it turns out to be. So, and then we just start working, and it just sort of happens. And he was a very positive person too, so very easy to work with, and the design flowed very quickly, and like really didn't have a lot of friction, so pretty easy. The Asgardian refugee vessel, which if you go back and think about Thor Ragnarok, that's the ship that Thor and his friends escape on. But technically that ship came back from the battle planet where Hulk and Thor, first meet. So you kind of like, I worked with an illustrator named Till Novak. He did the exterior of that in Thor Ragnarok. Actually, I think he was sitting across from me, or in the same room when I was doing the observatory. So he did that, which had this really big, weird, like almost like cannon / cockpit. I'm gesturing with my arm. No one's going to know what I'm talking about. And so if you remember Jeff Goldblum's character, he was supposed to sit in this main chair, and it had these big, giant cogs on the sides of the ship that this, I think what it was supposed to be was actually like a giant weapon of some type that would get lowered up and down. So you can see it actually in Avengers. So crazy thing about Marvel movies is how they're so interconnected and such a shared universe, while each trying to be their own individual project. You can see how all those influenced the design for that particular piece. We'd sometimes get in these situations where we'll design a set and we will present it and we'll be moving forward with it, but we'll just run into a physical restraint of like there's just no money, or there's no time, or there's no space for this. So we actually had to scrap a lot of it and just sort of change the whole sort of expectation of that particular set. You don't know though, because it looked great on the screen. It's just interesting how constraints can actually be beneficial sometimes, give you a different outcome.
Real world problems.
Yeah, exactly. different things. Like, for example, when you talk about designing something realistic like the submarine, you can obviously find like real world sort of examples of how that would look. But here's the thing, you can't actually shoot in a real world submarine, right? There's no way you would fit a camera crew in there, and it would be no fun to do any action scenes inside of a submarine because you can't have Aquaman like wrestling with a guy in a cramped space where you can't even stand up straight. So that's when you take sort of liberties and need to have a little bit of conversation with the art director and production designer about what the actual stunt work is going to be in something like that. So as much as there's always a look of like, emphasis on what the set will look like and how that look will reinforce the story, sometimes you also have to think about how that set is going to be functional in for the camera crew themselves, for the stunt workers themselves. So you don't want to make something that's very difficult to be in because that will impact the performance in possibly a negative way. You want to have the set be accessible and for the camera crew to be able to get in there. So I don't know if you ever saw this movie. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but they're some of the funnest movies. So I worked on Fast and the Furious 8, and there's a prison scene where The Rock and Jason Statham.
I did see it, but I'll agree that once 7 was done, I think it kind of.
They're so popular, but so there's a scene where Jason Statham and The Rock get locked up in this silly mega prison, and they get out. And once they get out, the entire set is basically a jungle gym for them to fight in, right? So obviously, when we were designing that, we had, okay, this has to look severe enough and menacing enough where these are the type of places you send the most dangerous people. This is where you send The Rock, and you send Jason Statham, keep them in this danger, these dangerous people locked up. So then you got to think, okay, after that, once they're out, basically we want to have a huge fight scene and have a lot of fun and have people jumping off walls and through actually levels down into other floors below. So that's fun. But that takes a lot of dialogue between the art department and the stunt department, stunt coordinators. And I hope there's still, I hope you don't think it's all primarily function. There still is an element of aesthetic and what's pleasing to see and what shapes are, desirable. But again, you can't get lost in that because you still have to always go back in your head and think what reinforces the story. And that's what I do. And so whenever I'm designing and working, I always try and give everything a reason. That way, because there are certain directors actually will ask you, what is that? I was lucky enough to do a bunch of different projects with David Fincher. And he's a person who actually likes to have those conversations. We did a project that never happened called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Many people have been attached to this movie and it just hasn't hit yet. I think it would be, I'm super excited for when it does because that's a fun, I think, world the Jules Verne made. Anyways, David was like, let's see the interior of the submarine, or let's see what the, how are these things powered? And he wants to talk about the propulsion systems, and he wants to actually have a reason behind the layout of Nemo's secret underwater base. He likes that, and I think it helps him with his storytelling. It's not necessarily something maybe that the audience will ever know, but I also it's just a fun. It's fun when the person you're trying to help with is actually just as excited as you are to talk about the silly details and minutia. So,
and I think a couple of times you with your design process mentioned the camera crew, and that is something that I want to jump onto for the next question, because when we're generally designing spaces, very broadly spaces as we understand them in our real life, you design them for human experience, but when you're designing them, you're designing it for an instrument, a machine, which is operated by a human, but
sure.
It's meant to be viewed in a different way. So, in addition to these fictional worlds, you've also been a part of projects which are based in the present-day world. And if I had not seen your work, I would not know that many of these shooting locations were actually set. So, particularly thinking about the stage and the podium that you designed for House of Cards and the house in Gone Girl, which I think Rosamund Pike, I I love her and I love that movie, and it's incredible the way that movie was made. But I would have never guessed that that house wasn't like a real house.
Right.
Like something that existed and that you would just like walk in and it would show up in the movie. And both of these look so realistic and so permanent, like they already exist somewhere. And that makes me think about the common thread between architecture with a capital A that I studied and practiced, and the set design that you studied and practiced. And both of our fields and training deal with space making very, very broadly. But you kind of have a one-up because you don't need to worry about the structural part of it as much, and I'm kind of jealous of that. But you also design these spaces keeping in mind their temporality, knowing that they're going to be torn down and dismantled after the shooting ends. And most importantly, you are designing these spaces for the camera. So for a human experience of the space through the medium of screen versus in person. And that is definitely not something that we do in our practice as architects. What do you think about it? About the intersection of architecture and set design and your perspective of designing these very architectural places for the camera?
Well, I think that obviously, what is the camera, right? It's a surrogate for the human eye, right? It's us. But like when you talk about what, at least my experience with architecture and with architecture that I enjoy, obviously I'm viewing it and I see it in its place and where someone has planned it and has executed it. You know, it's like this is an interesting thing because when I'm in a real world space and I'm inside of a piece of architecture, or at least in front of or interacting with a piece of architecture that someone designed, there's obviously a very subtle but tactful experience they're trying to tell me, right? The architect's trying to tell me something, or at least trying to interact with me. You know what I mean? And through their space and their space planning. Now, of course, there's technical aspects of it, like the amount of sprinkler heads and the amount of access points and things like that, right? But still, the overall project is supposed to make me feel something as well. And that's where I think we both will intersect. We're both trying to give somebody an experience that they can interpret themselves. You know, like we're trying to reach all different people and interact with them, especially with the way I think cinema is becoming more and more worldly and diverse. We're trying to reach out and interact with people and film is probably, I think, and this sounds strange to say, but I think film and mass entertainment, mass media is one of the last great like American exports, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? It's still something that's, I think, uniquely, American blockbuster, right? Is like kind of like, it's a unique thing still. Other countries are challenging that and changing the way cinema works, and that's great, and I love it. But like the summer blockbuster is still something that's very unique. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how you talked about the permanence of it. I mean, in a way, like maybe this is naive, right? But film can be so permanent forever. You know, it can be imprinting on people, and it's especially with nowadays with access. Like we can be looking at these Marvel movies, or we can be looking at the David Fincher's work for the next 100 years. You know, versus sometimes the changing world, especially in some place like Los Angeles, where buildings are torn down and new things are erected, for that, which is, you know, in this environment is actually quite common. It's interesting when you start thinking about that, right? Like how certain architecture can be less permanent than cinema, even though literally those sets you're talking about are worked on for a few months, shot in sometimes for 3 or 4 days, and then torn down and thrown in a dumpster, which we can talk about the environmental impact of that as well. It's not the friendliest when it comes to renewables and et cetera, et cetera. There's been, luckily, a great push to make each studio make itself more and more environmentally friendly, and that's definitely, even in my lifetime, I've seen that change 100-fold. Either way, there's definitely an interesting intersection between those two. but going back to talking about Gone Girl and those particular sets, I mean that was an interesting movie in particular because the house was so much of a character.
Yeah.
Because I mean it's the typical oversized American home that has no real I say it's a character, but that home actually has no character. It's just a large volume with vaulted ceilings and a ridiculous spiral staircase in the foyer. The McMansion of the Midwest. And how empty it is, right, and how hollow it is, which was a good foil for and mirror for their relationship, right? So this is a point where we were talking about earlier how the set, the environment is hopefully reinforcing the story. And I think in that particular show, that I think worked 100%. But again, of course it's going to work because that production designer, Donald Burt, Oscar-winning production designer, worked with David Fincher, numerous projects. It's guaranteed. There's no failure, especially when David Fincher's involved because he demands a very high level of execution, which I enjoy.
But, it's interesting you mentioned that the sets or these spaces kind of immortalize themselves on screen through the form of, a TV show or a movie. Because I didn't think about it that way. And it makes so much sense when you say that. Because while, I was thinking about what we could talk about, and instantly I was like, well, you're basically putting in all this effort for creating temporal spaces. I mean, how could you not get attached to something you designed, which is going to be torn down in, as you said, 3 or 4 days?
Right.
And
it can be that quick.
Yeah.
Too. It's a crazy thing to think about, the amount of effort that can go into 2 lines of stage direction,
And you've been kind enough to put a lot of your drawings and your work on your website, and you see the construction drawings and you see the kind of detailing, and you could actually take those drawings and build something more permanent. I wouldn't say permanent as in to last for eternity,
Right.
But something that could exist for definitely more than 3 to 4 days. This is just my own curiosity question. Do you ever get attached to your sets? And does it ever do you have separation anxiety when you know that it's done and it's going to be torn down? Or is that some sort of joy in knowing that it's now been shot in and that it's going to have a different life on the screen for a longer period of time?
Yeah.
Do you ever get emotional about it?
I don't. That's an interesting question. And I want to let that sit for a second because I don't know. I think that because I know it's so temporary that I don't get attached to particular locations. I have feelings and echoes of emotions, but they're more tied to the process. I will always remember the process of making something, and I will look back and say I liked that process, or I will sit back and think about how that a certain process might have been more difficult than others. But I will look more towards that than the product. I will look at the result of how it was on screen, and I also like to hear how positively
It's been received?
Yes, exactly. And be the director or the shooting crew or the actors or the stuntmen. If it's worked well for all those people, I know that it's going to be good on screen because obviously if there's no barriers to performance and the story, then those things are going to come across. And then the set becomes sort of, not that it's unnoticeable, but it should just be an aftertaste. It's you feel it, you recognize it, you know where you are. It tells you, what is happening. And I always love when you can see that the cinematographer enjoys it because maybe they use it framing. They might do some interesting angles where they use the lines of the set to direct the eye. That I always get a kick out of that. And yeah, that's, again, I'd go back to say I enjoy the process, or I don't. I enjoy the process, or I will not enjoy the process. But that's the part I focus on the most, on how we got there. But the times I've worked for Donald Burt and David Fincher are probably high up on my list of excellent moments. But there's a movie called The Tragedy of Macbeth that I worked on. Yeah, by Ethan Coen, the director of the Coen brothers. It's his solo project starring Denzel Washington, Frances McDermott. That even though I just worked on that, is also, and I haven't seen the result yet. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but I had such a good time and I enjoyed the process immensely. The interaction with the production designer, myself, the art directors, cinematographer, directors, it was one of the best collaborative experiences I've had in a long time. So that's what fuels me. That's what gives me a lot of up, is those moments like that.
I think two things, if I were to run. I think when you said, you try to create the least amount of barriers for performance, it actually shows on screen when the environment is so perfect and so set that you just almost purely focus on the choreography of thing and how just acting and costume and the set, everything just seems like it's in perfect symphony. And especially while you'd say that, we shouldn't be worrying about films during COVID, I actually feel differently. I feel that that's something that's kept everybody kind of sane and occupied up to some level, when at least the whole thing started was just everybody got a Netflix subscription and everybody was experiencing space through the medium of that black screen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because you couldn't step out, whether you're watching, Gone Girl one day or you're watching Fast and Furious the other day, you're using that camera as a surrogate for the human eye and going through these spaces, whether you watch reality shows or whatever. But
yeah,
it's experiencing those spaces through the medium of the screen. So I think in the end, it all makes sense. But if I were to just sum it up and, have one last question for you, I would love to know what's next for you. Any exciting upcoming projects to talk about, the Macbeth one, but anything else, and any advice for people who want to venture out on the path that you've traveled?
Oh, for sure. So I did talk about the Tragedy of Macbeth, and I think that's going to be very interesting. It's shot in black and white, like I said, Ethan Coen. So there's already a lot of reasons to see that. I think that is an A24 film. So I'm 90% sure that's going to be in the theater at some point, which, again, like I say, and thanks for saying that about what we do. It's interesting because I think sometimes when you're involved in something, you don't see maybe how unique the experience is for other people. And in the enjoyment of like mass media, entertainment, film business, TV shows. I mean, I love different things as well. But I also will just happily sit down and watch the Great British Bake Off nonstop. It's lovely for many different reasons, I'm sure. But I would also like to eat good food, and go out to a restaurant again. So maybe that's a little bit of that. Let's see what else I have. Another project, I think it's actually, this is the only horror movie I've ever done. It's called Malignant, and it's James Wan of Fast and Furious, and I believe what his early film was, The Conjuring, I think was the series he did. And if I'm getting that wrong, I'm sorry, James Wan. But yeah, it's an interesting horror movie. That was a lot of fun to do as well. But I think it's just stuck in the queue. It's just waiting for things to open up again. The Loki TV show, which again, I think what will be the third release after Winter Soldier and the Falcon. I worked on that as well. That should be very interesting. I'm not going to say anything about that because, Disney will have my head. Yeah, so that was another good project. One of my very dear friends, Kazra, was the production designer on that show. So again, he was very delightful to work for. Beyond that, I can't speak on much, but I will just say, obviously, Black Adam is coming out in a few years, right? And Black Panther 2 as well should be coming out in a year or two, who knows?
Ryan Coogler.
Yes, yeah, I'm excited to be involved in those projects.
Fun fact, I wrote an entire paper on Hannah Beachler's design process.
All right, yeah.
Kind of just like she was over at the GST one time to just talk about, of course, from an urban point of view, on how she conceptualized the city of Wakanda and how it kind of checks all the boxes of what urban design should look like. So it was kind of that from that academic standpoint, but just a cycle of, she draws a lot from this architect, Zaha Hadid's work.
Yeah.
And Zaha Hadid draws from Russian constructivist work. So just kind of the cyclic process of design on where people draw inspiration from. And I was so fascinating. For a very brief period of time, I was on Twitter and I tagged her on this paper that I was presenting, and I went to Colombia for that. I presented in Bogota, and I just kind of put it up on Twitter, and she retweeted, and I'd lost my head. Like, Hannah Beachler retweeted, but I love the Black Panther series.
She's a good person. She's a good person, for sure, 100%. And I don't think anyone else could have done Black Panther like she did. You know, I unfortunately didn't get to work on that because it was coinciding at the same time as the final Avengers movies. So it was kind of a hard decision. But yeah, she's wonderful. And I think that she will deliver the same kind of execution that she did for that movie on this one. But yeah, she's also another super friendly person to reach out to. It's interesting that you brought up Zahadi Hadid, because when I was preparing for this, I wrote down like a list of like, okay, because unfortunately I have to like keep changing my, like I refresh my design Rolodex, like in things that I'm gonna look for inspiration, and I wrote down a list of things. I was like, make sure so I'm not caught flat-footed. But Russian constructionism and brutalism in general is something that I love and draw upon. There's I don't know if I can even say this, but there's a Tumblr site called Architecture of Doom, which I think is a perfect
write it down
name.
Because it sounds like I would love it.
Yeah. It's basically great architecture stills of Eastern Europe and South American cities, which I try and think about, like, why are we drawn to these inspirations for otherworldly design? And I think it's because as a Western society, obviously, when we go and see things like Plattenbaus in Eastern Berlin or something like that, or just some of the grand like government buildings in Latin America and such like that, these big broad shapes, they're so foreign to us. And so I think that must be why, like, when we're designing for science fiction and fantasy, that they kind of lend themselves to that. Again, that's from an American perspective, obviously, because they, in other countries especially, would have, I think, a different and unique experience of viewing it and seeing maybe shapes and buildings that they might identify with as
more familiar.
The local milieu presented as, an otherworldly environment. So I've always been curious about that, if anyone ever felt that way. But maybe also people don't realize maybe where the inspiration of some of these things are pulled from. But
hey, everything you design also becomes something of an inspiration to somebody else. So I guess the cycle goes on, right? I mean, you might
I can actually tell you that I worked on Inception a long time ago, and I worked on a particular one part of it, the hospital complex that there's a heist there, I think, of some I can't even remember what the reason they went there was, but anyway, so there's a heist at this hospital complex, and it's based on a very, I think, particular building, and I don't remember what it is, so this is going to catch me flat-footed. But so we drew inspiration for that based off of that particular piece of architecture. Some of my friends were the set designers primarily on that. I worked actually technically on the miniature portion of that, because that set was we did in a miniature form in a parking lot behind this visual effects studio, and then they exploded it, for the practical effect, which is super cool. If anyone ever wants to see that, just Google, I think it would be New Deal Studios Inception miniature, and I think those are still up online, and you can see them like assemble this massive miniature and then, blow it up and then tear it all down and build it back up again and blow it up a second time. But regardless, long story, I was reading an X-Men comic and it's the new series, and in the first couple pages was basically stills, more or less, of the Inception complex. So we took that inspiration from that particular architect, which came into the movie, which then obviously some other artist, this comic book artist, took his inspiration for his background for this particular complex he made. So when you say that, that's funny. I don't ever think of it, but you're right. It is true. I want to get back one more thing, for advice on people who want to try and become movie makers, filmmakers, whatever you want to call us in general, is that to obviously move to a area which there is filmmaking, first off.
101.
Yeah, like wherever that is. Toronto, Atlanta, Los Angeles, obviously, but there's still movies being made in New York and Chicago and other places like that. And that I'm sure internationally there are other cities as well. But my experience is here, so that's basically the best I can speak on, is that you can move to LA, try and find the cheapest apartment you can, which is difficult, which means you're going to maybe live with 5 other people, and become a PA in an art department. And it might be it might feel like a lateral move or a step down at first, but it's going to be great. You're going to get a lot of experiences. You're going to see how the process works. You're going to meet people. You're going to impress people. And that's going to be the basis of, your sort of social network, and it's going to help you in your career. It's not easy for everybody because the time period can just sort of, be challenging. You might see your peers might get an opportunity before you do, but perseverance, if you can, is key. Is key. Just hold out and reach out to us. Reach out to people. Google them, email them. I would bet you most of them are going to return your phone call probably within a couple of days.
That's a wonderful note to end this on. I think perseverance is always the key. But I want to thank you so much for being here today. This has been an incredible conversation, and one that I wanted to have since so long. So thank you so much for taking that time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Special thanks to Kahan Shah for the background score. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Architecture Off Center on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes are released every 2 weeks. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Arc Off Center. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thanks for listening.